Deputy President, and I rise to speak on the Disability and Social Services Regulation Amendment Bill 2023. This is a fantastic piece of legislation that aims to enhance services, safeguards, rights and protections for people with a disability. This tells the story of a state that is modern, fair and informed to the needs of every single one of its constituents. This bill reflects wholeheartedly a government that cares about every single resident in this state. And this bill covers a range of amendments that will help reform disability and social services regulations legislation into the 2020s. Over the past decade, it had become apparent that there are some changes that need to be made, so some Victorians are not given the chance they deserve. And this is not acceptable. The 1.1 million Victorians living with a disability deserve better, and that's exactly what this bill delivers. A tenet of the Andrews Labor government is that we listen to experts. We take on what they have to say, and that's just what we've been done here. The Disability and Social Services Regulation Amendment Bill 2023 forms the second stage of the Disability Act review. The amendments being presented today are the second part of this review of the Disability Act 2006. The Disability Act review started in 2019 and will identify and address issues within our state's disability legislation. Many of the amendments are informed by public submissions ranging back to 2021, collected by Engage Victoria. The outcome that this will achieve is a modern, strong and fit-for-purpose Disability Act that helps Victorians with disabilities for many generations to come. The Disability Act functionality written by Victorians with the lived experience of a disability. This bill is in some part the adoption of Inclusive Victoria, State Disability Plan 2022 to 2026. Inclusive Victoria is a review of Victoria's disability legislation, concluding in a recommended 4-year plan with 6 systemic reforms and 4 broad-based areas of commitment. The review comprised heavily of community voices, the voices of people who know firsthand exactly what needs to change in our disability support programs, Victorians with disabilities. That means that this legislation is heavily influenced directly by the exact people it seeks to help. Because, and to quote the Ministers Ford from then Minister for Disability, Ageing and Carers, my friend in the other place, Minister Carbines, Victorians with disabilities deserve no less. The report covers many areas of the aspects of lived experience of Victorians with disabilities, specifically what can be improved and how it can be improved. The plan offers a valuable guide to ensure a path to a safer, fairer, more inclusive Victoria for Victorians living with a disability. The plan touches on 6 systemic reforms: co-design with people with a disability, Aboriginal self-determination, intersectional approaches, accessible communications and universal design, disability confident and inclusive workforces, effective data and outcome reporting. The plan has been co-designed by Victorians with disabilities, and findings recommendations that this principle be used whenever policies, programs or services are designed. This is called a nothing about us principle. This is the best way to ensure that disability policies, programs and services are informed to the best course of action. Aboriginal self-determination across all portfolios, policies and programs is essential. This goes without saying. Every finding in the Closing the Gap report pointed towards better outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people when allowed to run a community and culturally informed programs, especially fields like health. Intersectionality is incredibly important when building services that are sensitive to the needs and experiences of people who will be using them. It allows for programs to be better informed and responsive to the overlapping disadvantages faced by many Victorians. Ensuring that all communications are accessible and equitable is a key and effective policy, program or service. What would be the point of a service if groups of the people it established for can't even access it due to the communication barriers? Inclusive workforces will be integral in creating a truly inclusive Victoria. For Victorians living with disabilities, there are many educational measures workplaces should take. but more effective than employing people with disabilities. And finally, effective data and outcome reports mean that the relevant bodies can appropriately adapt and address measures taken to create a more inclusive space. Known as, or as possible, what's working, what's not, and how to achieve the best possible outcomes. Additionally, the plan presents 4 commitments with 22 priorities spread under each commitment. These 4 commitments are inclusive communities, health, housing and wellbeing, fairness and safety, opportunity and pride. The Disability and Social Services Regulation Bill 2023 focuses mainly on fulfilling commitments 2 and 3, health, housing and wellbeing, and fairness and safety. The bill is also informed by the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with a Disability. It showed that action needed to be taken, and that's what we're doing. This is a matter of wellbeing and safety, a matter of basic human rights. This bill clarifies, strengths and safeguards for Victorians with disabilities, especially those in care. Further consultation on this bill has been widespread to ensure the best outcomes for Victorians with disabilities and those working with the disability service sectors. Stakeholders who have been also consulted include the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, the Office of Public Advocate, the Victorian Senior Practitioner, Office of the Victorian Information Commissioner, Health Complaints Commission, Victoria Legal Aid, National Disability Service, Victorian Council of Social Services, Carers Victoria and the Victorian Disability Worker Commission. This bill is comprehensive, deserving this Chamber's support, which is important because it deals with some of the most vulnerable people in our state, people that we in this space and in this place and the other have the responsibility to ensure that they never fall through any of the cracks in the system again. We have a responsibility to ensure that the government bodies are structured and supported in such a way that the opportunity for independence is readily available. And most importantly, we have the responsibility to ensure that Victorians with disabilities can thrive in all areas of their lives. As a responsible government, the Andrews Labor government does what the facts and the experts suggest is best for the community at large and the individual. The bill addresses several acts of parliament and at the recommendation of the Inclusive Victoria report. This includes, but not limited to, the Disability Act, Residential Tenancy Act, Disability Services Act and the Social Services Regulation Act. Where do I even start with this bill? It addresses screening, treatment, carers, education, housing and much more. And for the purpose of ensuring that Victorian legislation has clarity and is beneficial to Victorians with disabilities. Much of this bill is ensuring or solidifying the rights and protections of Victorians living with disabilities. The bill also sets out to provide a framework to improve the delivery of disability services in Victoria, whilst addressing certain bureaucratic barriers that have negatively affected the swift, effective and helpful delivery and implementation of the NDIS and other disability services. We're going to update and modernise the disability services sector, improve it and make it fit to be used, but without sacrificing the safeguard and the protections needed for a modern legislative framework. In line with requests from the community, shown in the findings from the 2019 Disability Act Review and Inclusive Victorian Plan, we have taken a long, hard look at the Disability Act 2006 and found there are necessary changes that must be implemented for a fairer and safer Victoria. This is executed within the bill in a variety of ways, including clarifying legislation regarding frameworks for sharing and seeking information, slim down legislative duplication surrounding the requirements for the use and authorisation of restrictive practices used by registered disability service providers, NDIS and otherwise. Clarifying the roles, responsibilities and functions of the Secretary of the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, and many other amendments to deliver the modernisation and improvement of the disability legislation in Victoria. Amendments to the Disability Services Safeguards Act 2018 alter the process by which would be employed applies to a Disability Worker Registration Board of Victoria. In accordance with recommendations and findings from the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with a Disability, the amendments allow for a current NDIS worker's clearance to be accepted as a satisfactory supplement for a criminal background check. This will cut the cost putting money back into other areas of the disability services whilst not sacrificing the safeguards and safety of the NDIS service clients. The role of the Secretary for Family, Fairness and Housing will also better be defined by amendments in this bill. It refines, defines and clarifies the roles and responsibilities of the Secretary for Family, Fairness and Housing. It limits the services that the Secretary has power over to those services which are funded by the Secretary. This will ensure that there is clarity over the exact responsibilities of the Secretary. The Secretary will be able to, using the information they will come across naturally in their role, advise the relevant ministry. In this case, the Minister for Disability and Ageing cares on the relevant issues to families, fairness and housing. The Secretary will also be awarded the right to acquire land for the establishment of a specialist disability accommodation dwelling and, depending on the circumstances, dispose of the said land without consideration. On the topic of specialist disability accommodation, amendments will be made to the Residential Tenancy Act, which will provide much needed clarity on the rights of those living in specialist disability accommodation. At this stage, renters living in specialist disability accommodation and or group homes exist in something of a legal twilight zone, as they are not addressed in many of the express rights given under the Residential Tenancies Act. This bill will ensure such a predicament is a thing of the past, awarding renters in a specialist disability accommodation the express rights they deserve. This is compatible with one of the 4 commitments over the 4 years set out by the Inclusive Victoria State Disability Plan. Commitment 2, Health, Housing and Wellbeing. Additionally, this legislation extensively covers restrictive practices on people in the care of either the Disability or NDIS service or a Disability Support for Older Australians program. The second public hearing from the Royal Commission identified restrictive practices as one of the key drivers, forms of violence, abuse, neglect used on children with a disability. And we have learned over the last decade abuse and negligence is a real threat to our loved ones who are in care. This is entirely unacceptable, and our legislation should reflect efforts that stamp out any kind of risk or harm to NDIS, DSOA or disability services clients. Thanks to the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability, these stories can be used to understand how to improve our system, our institutions and how they make sure we can create strong legislation to avoid repetition in this abuse. This bill seeks to, under amendments to the Disability Act 2006, centralise the appointment of the APO or Authorised Programmed Officer to the Victorian Public Practitioner. This is to minimise the confusion and costs caused by the NDIS and non-NDIS APO appointments falling under different authorities. The primary role of the Authorised Program Officer is, quote, to promote and reduce and eliminate the use of restrictive practices by disability service providers, registered NDIS providers to the greatest extent possible, so it is possible that we ensure the assignment program is efficient and effective. This will be achieved by this amendment without sacrificing safeguards that protect the users of these respective services. It's essential that state governments effectively aid the delivery of the NDIS service. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is another important Australian program, and I believe it gets to the core of what it means to be Australian, making sure everyone gets a fair go. It is the duty and responsibility of each and every state government in Australia to assist and strengthen the delivery of the NDIS and the NDIS service in their respective states. Now, with the new advantage being made by the Federal Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme every day, it is important that state governments keep up to make sure that all Australians with disabilities. I am proud to say that the Andrews Labor government is committed to a smooth, strong and efficient delivery of the NDIS within Victoria. The bill also includes countless minor amendments to the Social Services Regulation Act 2021 to ensure the effective operation and update of the regulatory scheme. This is all about ensuring Victoria has an effective, robust and compassionate framework for disability services and NDIS services, a framework that does not sacrifice the safety of its users, nor does it sacrifice their dignity.
Mr. Berger, your time has expired. Ms. Bath.